Okay, day 42 video for 20th century history, and we're going over notes here. Actually, if those of you who come into the classroom every other day, you'll see there's a poster in the back that's actually causes of World War I, and it's just these four causes. You probably learned these in ninth grade from Mrs. Crane. Maybe you remember that, but since you're not ninth graders, we'll go over it again. So, we're looking at long-term causes of World War I here, and there really are four big ones. Imperialism, ethno-nationalism. I'm using that distinction because it's nationalism that's based on ethnicity that seems to be the problem, not just mere patriotism, which some people mean when they say nationalism. And you get all these really goofy arguments between people where one person says that nationalism is toxic, and the other person says that nationalism is just pledging allegiance to the flag and thinking bald eagles are cool. And they're both right because they're talking different things. Ethno-nationalism is toxic because it's based around something you can't change, which is your genetics, your ethnicity. Whereas a kind of what they often call civic nationalism in a place like the United States it isn't really based on race, since anyone can become American, and since the symbols of America are pretty neutral. I mean, maybe you can think that they're wonderful or evil, but it's just a flag with stars and stripes, and bald eagles are just birds of prey, so, whatever. It's when you get into ideas that some races are superior to others that you have huge issues. So we got imperialism, ethno-nationalism, militarism, and alliances. And you may think alliances, how can an alliance be bad? How can it be bad to have allies? Well, we'll get to that. So let me go through these. First, imperialism. This is a huge cause of dissension in our scenario, where people were wanting different scraps of territory from other groups. In one of the classes, people were actually selling territories in exchange for other territories, which technically didn't violate their scenario since they weren't giving something up, they were just exchanging things. But European countries had huge they had prestige in these colonies. Most of the colonies weren't profitable. British India was very profitable for Britain, and the Dutch East Indies, what's now Indonesia, was very profitable for the Dutch, the Netherlands. Other than that, most of these colonies were not productive. The French owned huge swathes of desert. So did the Italians here in bright red. Heck, I'm not even sure we made any money from the Philippines ourselves. The French did have some, like rubber plantations in this area that's now Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, but a lot of it's just jungle. So, but the thing is, people thought that these colonies brought them prestige and helped their economy by creating markets for their country's products and cheap raw materials. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes trying to police the colony was more trouble than anything else. You can see Afghanistan was a huge thing in this scenario because Britain owned what's now Pakistan and India, and Russia is right here, and right in the middle is Afghanistan. And here you can see the Russian bear and the British lion, and they're on either sides of this fellow who represents Afghanistan, and he's rather worried that they might eat him, because both wanted Afghanistan. You can see here, this is Cecil Rhodes, the British guy they named the Rhodes Scholarship after. This guy was a huge colonialist. You can see here he's the Colossus of Rhodes, and he's striding from one end of Africa, in South Africa, to Egypt on the other end. Huge area. So, make sure that I'm recording properly. Yes, I am. Good. I did a video yesterday, and I thought I was recording for 15 minutes, and it turns out I hadn't been, so I wanted to double check here. Anyway, so Rhodes had this idea of, well, we need to have British land go from one end of Africa to the other so we can run a railroad and a telegraph line. The only problem is that if you look at Africa, there's the British pink, but look in the middle here, here's a territory, what's now Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, that was owned by the Germans. By the way, these are the former colonies mapped on current African countries, if you're wondering what those lines are. And actually, the Germans trying to get in on colonialism is one of the causes of World War I. Germany had only become a unified country in 1871, after defeating the French in the Franco-Prussian War. And so they're late to the colonialism game, and they're like, hey, we want colonies. But there's not much left. The Italians get unified at the same time, and they have the same problem. This is why Germany and Italy end up with a lot of jungles and deserts, even more so than the French, who were just weak compared to the British. And so the Germans spend a lot of time and effort trying to get these colonies and put a lot of prestige into them, even though some of them, like over here, it's literally just a bunch of islands in the Pacific. Economically very primitive. And I don't mean that to insult the people there. I just mean that they're in an economic stage that Europe was in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before. But the Germans would recruit locals in Africa to serve as soldiers and spend huge amounts of time and money and cause huge amounts of bloodshed trying to hold the colonies together, and often committing atrocities to do so, like the Herero people, who were deliberately starved by the German colonial authorities in what's now Namibia. A really awful story. Also, when the German Empire unified, it took this slice of France, Alsace-Lorraine, which leads me to ethno-nationalism. You see, Alsace and Lorraine are two territories. Alsace is full of Germans, but Lorraine is full of French. And so one way that nationalism causes World War I is it makes one nation jealous of the other because you have our people. Notice this is not really an issue with the United States because what's the difference between a Canadian and an American? It's not anything ethnic. You can find people with Italian last names in Canada and Italian last names in America, like I have an Italian last name. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that you pledge allegiance to the U.S. and are a citizen there, or you pledge allegiance to the Queen of Canada, who's also the Queen of the U.K., by the way, and you're a Canadian citizen, or subject. But ethno-nationalism means that your people are in some other country and we have to go rescue them. And so you can see here, this is 16 years after the Franco-Prussian War, this painting was made. It's called The Black Spot, Le Tache Noire. And it's a school in France, and this kid's being shown a map of France, and you can just make out there Alsace and Lorraine are black, the black spot. So what this teacher is telling the class is, guys, when you get older, you have to avenge us on Germany. And by the way, this school also trains you in military matters. I only noticed this recently. In the back of this painting is a row of rifles. So these kids are being trained to be officers in the future and take back what's France's. The other way that nationalism causes World War I is by breaking countries apart. Austria-Hungary had a huge problem in our scenario, which was that they want to take over Serbia because the Serbians are agitating to get some of their fellow Serbs into their country. And Austria-Hungary has this issue where, Italy wants a chunk of them over here. The Germans, the Austrians who speak German, and the Hungarians only make up a chunk, and not even a majority of the country. There's lots of groups, Czechs, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Poles, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, Slovenians, all of whom want to be independent and want to break away. And that's going to make Austria-Hungary very unstable. And actually, Austria-Hungary is going to be the country that causes World War I, arguably. Because they're so unsettled, they feel the need to cause a war to try to gain control of the situation, and they end up just destroying themselves. Russia's got a similar issue. The Russian Empire is full of non-Russians, and I can illustrate this with some really awesome color photos. These are color photos from 115 years ago, made by this guy, Sergei Prokudkin-Gorsky. A Russian nobleman who he invented his own method of doing color photography, and it is amazing, and it doesn't fade over time. Very complex. You had to be a rich nobleman to do this, but this guy went around the Russian Empire taking pictures of the people there, and you can just see the massive diversity. I don't just mean diversity in terms of skin tone, which we've got. I'm talking massive diversity in terms of language, so they can't even communicate with each other. dress, manner of living, which you don't really have in the U.S., where people mostly dress the same way and do the same sorts of activities and can all communicate in English, with some exceptions of recent immigrants. So, for example, here's, I think this is the Muslim Emir of Bukhara, which is like Uzbekistan today. Here are some peasants, I think they may be Russian peasants from the steppes of Russia. Here are some, they're either Kazakhs or Kyrgyz. They're Muslims from Central Asia, but they're of East Asian descent, like related to Mongolians. Or here you have, I had some students who would have known, who told me this is Ukrainian peasant dress. I wouldn't know, but so Ukrainians are not the same as Russians, so they're like cousins, kind of, sort of. So that's another group. Here we have Greeks. There are Greeks in what's now Ukraine. Here harvesting tea. Notice a somewhat different manner of dress. It's not obvious to a newbie like me who doesn't really understand these sorts of things, but you can tell it's different. By the way, you can see that this color photography method involved putting one color on top of the other, because here's one area where the color didn't do right. Interesting little aside there. And here's a Muslim man from the Caucasus who looks very different from the other Muslims we've seen, and probably can't understand a word they're saying because he speaks something like Chechen as a language. And sorry. Here are some Jewish people from what's now Uzbekistan. There are Jewish people all over the Russian Empire, especially in the area that's now Poland. So Russia is constantly having problems because it has all these groups that also want to break away. Next, militarism. Arms races. In 1907, the UK created the battleship Dreadnought, which this is the kind of battleship that will look familiar to you if you've ever played World of Warships. No guns sticking out the side like you see on Admiral Dewey's ship, the Olympia. It's these big turrets, and these turrets, by the way, are huge and have to have basically steam elevators to bring the powder and the shell up to the gun to fire. This is a really neat little animation that Wikipedia has on it. Within a few years, this was out of date, though. The Germans start building battleships in their Hochseeflotte, their high seas fleet, so Britain makes new battleships, so the Germans respond. We're responding. We're about the third biggest navy at this point. The French are somewhere behind, with the Russians, Italians, and Austro-Hungarians really trailing. But there's this huge arms race, and within a few years, the newest high-tech is out of date. So huge amounts of money are being spent on weapons, and once you start making weapons, there's this huge temptation to want to try them out in battle. Once you convince yourself that the war will be short and easily victorious, then you can convince yourself to do all sorts of derpy things, like, start a war with another great power, which then turns into a world war, which gets millions of people killed. Slight issue there. And by the way, one of the technologies that the main powers are coming up with, which most don't think is all that important in 1914, but very quickly find out is very important, is the U-boat, the Unterseeboote. So that's a big deal. It's going to be what brings us into World War I, actually. In terms of alliances, at one point in the 19th century, Europeans tried to get along with each other. Tried very hard to get along with each other. They would have congresses where they tried to hash things out. As late as here's another Berlin conference. Usually they would hash things out at the expense of somebody, like they just chop up bits of the Ottoman Empire. Or here they just carve up bits of Africa. They didn't ask the Ottoman Turks or the Africans if they wanted to be carved up into little slices. It was usually when they could work together to exploit someone else that Europe got along. The last example is crushing the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 with the Eight-Nation Alliance. The problem becomes, though, is that once they're out of little people to go harass, because by 1914. The only parts of Africa that haven't been colonized are Liberia, which is founded by freed American slaves, and so The U.S. kind of wants that independent. Italy tried to conquer Ethiopia and failed. And the other areas are left as buffer zones, like Thailand or Afghanistan or Iran, or China. Remember the open door policy, they're just being exploited by everybody. And thanks to the Monroe Doctrine, this area is out of bounds for Europe. So they've taken every scrap of land they can, aside from Antarctica, which is just ice and penguins. So what do you do now? Well, you turn at each other. And so you start seeing alliances form. The Triple Entente, which you can remember because it sounds French. The Entente is a French word. The actual name of it was the Entente Cordiale originally, between France and Russia. And then Britain jumped on. And then the Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Italy, by the way, will backstab its allies later. It's a goofy story. But this may seem like, wow, alliances are great. We have friends now. Well, yeah. The only problem is that if one of your allies gets involved in a war you have no interest in, you get sucked in. So Russia is allied to Serbia. Austria-Hungary hates Serbia. If Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, then Russia will feel the need to attack Austria-Hungary, which means that Germany has to get sucked in, which means that France and Britain get sucked in. And it becomes a huge, huge issue. And in fact, these alliances, what should have been a war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, one of many sorts of wars in the Balkans in this time period, turns into a world conflict because this was Slavic allies of Russia, Serbia and Montenegro. Basically, the way this is set up is that so many countries are allied with each other that if one gets sucked in, they all get sucked in. Okay, that's all for today. You've got a lot of things to be working on in Schoology. Let me go back to the home page. You've got various things to, especially for remote learners, you need to do your rankings yet for the scenario. And if you're done with that, then start working on the research topic. Start thinking very deliberately about the objective research project. That's all for today.